Fruit of the poisonous tree. A lone woman walked along an empty dirt road, a heavy cloak drawn around her to try to obscure her face and sex from passers-by. Traveling without a male companion was risky enough at home. Here, in this unfamiliar world, it would be unwise not to take every precaution to protect herself. The sudden, thunderous pounding of horse hoofs on packed earth had her drawing the hood even further over her face, shrinking in on herself. Luckily for her, the horse and rider didn't give her a second look, racing away as fast as the steed could run. Margaret sighed in relief. She was safe for just a little longer. Still, the night was drawing near, and she didn't fancy sleeping in the bushes another night. She was already sore from walking for so long. If she had to sleep on the cold ground one more night, she might just scream. To her relief, after another few minutes of walking, she saw a small village nestled in the forest. Villagers were out and about, going about the last of their business for the day before night set in. A few people gave the newcomer curious looks, but no one paid too much attention to her, and for that she was glad. Under the cloak, a bright blue t-shirt and denim jeans would make her stand out like a sore thumb against the coarse brown dresses of the other women. Concealed under the heavy fabric, Margaret looked around, searching for something resembling an inn or somewhere she could stay for the night. Unfortunately, the medieval-looking town seemed to only consist of a few dozen houses and a church. "That'll have to do," she muttered, making her way to the church. A large house stood next to the wooden building, likely the pastor's house. Raising a closed fist to the oaken door, she rapped twice before stepping back. Within the house, she could hear shuffling and heavy footsteps before the door was opened, revealing an aging man in an old priest's garb. "Yes, can I help you?" he asked. "I'm a traveler with no place to stay. Have you a place that I can sleep for the night?" she responded. Thankfully, the priest nodded, motioning her to come inside. As she stepped over the threshold, she grinned. This was the first stroke of luck she had had since being torn from her home and left for dead in this strange backwoods country.
What has befallen you, my child? It's not safe for a young woman like yourself to be out alone so late. Margaret sighed. The events of the past 2 days had been both amazing and incredibly taxing. I'm lost, I guess? I woke up in the forest a few days ago. I don't know where I am or what's going on. The priest frowned at her, concerned. Well, at least one of those questions is easy to answer. You're in Annenberg, on the western edge of the forest. No, you see, I don't know what that means, Margaret insisted. What kingdom am I in? Where's Annenberg? I don't even know what continent this is. The priest's confusion deepened. What's a continent? It's like a large landmass? How do you not know this? There are like 7 of them? The priest gave her a blank look. They're all surrounded by oceans? Really, really huge? Margaret replied. Her panic was growing steadily. There are no lands beyond the Great Sea, the priest said. Margaret froze. A single, improbable, impossible conclusion formed out of the confusion on her mind. No, that can't be it, she thinks. I'm sorry, sir. What's the date? She asked shakily. The 10th of March. No, the year. 1512. How long have you been outside, child? I fear you've caught a chill. The priest replies, completely unaware that his offhand comment slammed home the final nail in Margaret's coffin. I've time-traveled? I've time-traveled. Oh my. Margaret stood stock still. Her hands began to tremble. This was impossible. She had to be dreaming, or delusional, or something. Anything that wasn't a time-traveler. Suddenly, a reedy voice broke through her thoughts. Excuse me, mister? Where do you keep the water? It was a boy, maybe around 7 or 8. His face was flushed and sweaty, but he shivered violently despite the thick blanket he'd wrapped around his shoulders. He stood, half hidden in the shadow of the doorway, on the threshold of the entryway. In the kitchen. I'll show you, the priest said gently, stooping, despite his age, down to the boy's level. Meet my guest. She's rather confused, and just a touch ill, just like you, the priest continued as he led both Margaret and the boy down the hall to the kitchen. Are you sick too, ma'am? The boy asked. He tentatively reached out a hand, and Margaret held it carefully, letting him lead her after the priest. Reverend John can take care of you, too. I don't think I'm sick the way you are. But what's up with you, huh? Margaret said, smiling down at the child. Up close, he looked older, maybe around 11, just tiny and undernourished. The boy was confused by her words. Come on, Margaret. What's up? You're literally in the medieval ages. What's he supposed to do with what's up? But responds, I have a wasting disease. I've been sent to live with Reverend John until the doctor can complete me. Margaret stopped dead. They want to bleed you? Are you serious? Yes, ma'am? How else do you cure sickness? Like, literally any other way. Like, any other way. Leaving you alone in the woods surrounded by wolves would be better than getting a doctor to bleed you, Margaret said. The force of her voice startled the boy, but she couldn't help it. I could do better than that quack doctor. Let's get some water and go back to bed, yeah? Are you a healer, ma'am? Can you hear me? I like the Reverend, but I want to go see my mother. Yeah, animated like he hadn't been before. Yeah, I'll have you back to your mother in no time at all. I promise.
Margaret crouched by the bed, the hearth in the far corner of the room throwing up shadows every which way. The poor child was still asleep, but he wouldn't be for long. All the wonders of modern medicine, and I can't use them to save this boy, she thought. The room was warm, bordering on stuffy. She hadn't slept properly in over a month now. There were just too many sick people. Since that first night at the Reverend's house, Margaret had become one of the most sought-after healers in the village. Her simple remedies were incredibly popular amongst those who had suffered generations of bleeding and leeching. Margaret curled her legs up underneath herself and folded her arms on the bed, perching her head on her arm so she could watch her patient. He seemed peaceful in sleep. The space between his eyebrows, normally crumpled in pain, was smooth. She stretched out a hand to brush the hair off of his forehead. The room was warm, and her patient was alive. Margaret settled her head more comfortably upon her arms and closed her eyes. Surely nothing bad will happen if I just rest for a minute. The fire slowly burned away the last of its wood, the merry dancing flames subsiding until there was but a faint glow emanating from the dying embers. In the shadowy half-night all was still and silent. An owl hooted outside. A murder of crows startled and took off. The weight of 5 horses slammed against the muddy road outside Margaret's house. Their hooves thudded and squelched in the muck. The metal on their saddles jingled. Their riders shifted from their vantage points. These dark shadows rasped and clanked, the sound of armor, ominous in the dark. They dismounted and gathered by the door. In perfect synchronicity, they slammed through the feeble wood and barreled into the small, one-room house. What's going on? Margaret asked groggily. The cold wind startled her, and she blinked awake just as one man picked her up in a fireman's tackle and dragged her outside. "No! Stop! What are you doing? Put me down!" she yelled, beating at her captor's shoulders. But he was immovable and hoisted her atop a horse, swinging on behind her before she could react. The 5 men and their captive rode off into the night. If the journey was rough, this hospitality's worse, Margaret thought hysterically as she was escorted down the gilded hallways of the literal castle she was dragged to. The horses had galloped all through the night, bringing them to this place by mid-afternoon. Margaret didn't know how far they had traveled, but it seemed like an insurmountable distance existed between her and the life she had carved out for herself. The guard guiding her around with a hand on her arm yanked her to a stop in front of a pair of massive gleaming doors. The doors burst open, creaking and groaning from the weight of all that wood. Margaret was pulled forward again. The room behind the doors was massive as well, and filled with people. The crowd parted for them as they passed, and so they crossed the room quickly. Margaret could only get impressions of the room around them, all of them blurred and nonsensical. Abruptly, they came to a halt again. "She's the witch," a voice asked from above her. Margaret gazed up confusedly and met the eyes of a young boy perched on a throne far larger than he was. "She doesn't look like the wicked monster you were warning me about." "I assure you, sire, she is no ordinary wench. Reports from 7 villages indicate that she has supernatural healing powers." The man who spoke stood by the throne, and while his words were for the king alone, he projected them, and the crowd jumped in fright at the mention of supernatural. "And what would you suggest, my dear Chancellor?" the king asked. He hardly seemed old enough to be a king. His shoulders were skinny, and the crown was perched lopsidedly on his head. "Execution, like with all accused of witchcraft." The king looked at Margaret over, considering. "Come, Chancellor, you're scaring the poor girl." "No, I have a better idea." He stood and came over to Margaret. He was taller than her, older than she had thought, not a child but a young man. His frame was lanky and willowy. Quite unlike what I would expect for a king, she thought. "How would you like a job? I recently fired our court healer."
It never ceased to surprise her to see just how little these people knew about medicine. Even completely untrained in the arts of healing, she knew so much more about the human body and all its ailments than all the supposed doctors of the court. Besides, it wasn't like she actually did do much. As much as the nobles marveled at all her supposed healing ability, they still went to the minor court physicians for anything major. She'd mostly been called for babies that had the sniffles or fainting ladies. Now that had been pretty funny the first few times. She'd always thought it was an exaggeration when the history books mentioned women swooning, but no, they fainted the slightest hint of trouble. Margaret was beginning to wonder if they had some sort of vitamin deficiency or something. There was no way fainting that easily was healthy. Healer? Are you alright? Margaret blinked, returning her attention to her young patient. Lady Elise looked at her, concerned. Yes, I'm fine, just a little lost in thought, Margaret said, chuckling. The other woman nodded. Oh, so what do you recommend? The tea and leeches the physician gave me didn't work. Margaret shook her head. They actually did. This is different from the cough you had before. This is a secondary sickness that people with cough often contract if they don't heal properly. Still, you need plenty of rest and lots of fluid. No wine or anything like that. Alcohol will just dehydrate you further. You need to be drinking sweet milk or herbal tea with honey, and in another week or so, you should be fine. Lady Elise smiled. Thank you. Thank you for your help, healer. Margaret curtsied before turning and exiting the ladies' chambers.
This is mandatory. All palace staff have to attend. Do not shame the crown with unbecoming conduct. You will cause a diplomatic incident and be executed, Margaret thought sarcastically as she hid nervously behind a plant. This was the second waltz of the night, and already 5 lords had come up to her, asking for a dance. I'm never letting Elise dress me ever again. Since Margaret had treated Lady Elise for her cough, the two had become close friends, spending much of their free time together. Throughout their friendship, Margaret had managed to avoid Elise's attempts to wedge her in a corset and drag her to a ball. However, the lady was leaving court to join her new husband, the French ambassador, in Normandy. This would be the last time the two would be together. You can't just hide here all night, Margaret. The point was to get you to dance, Elise hissed at Margaret, coming up behind her. Margaret jumped in surprise at her friend's sudden appearance. Oh, geez, don't scare me like that. And I would dance if any of the men would bother staring at my face instead of my chest when they asked. You know who wouldn't stare? The king, Elise suggested, a sly smirk on her face. Margaret blushed, hoping it was hidden under all of the powder. Don't be ridiculous. He has better things to do than fulfill my ridiculous fantasies. During her tenure as court physician, Margaret had only run into the king a few times, enough to develop a tiny, minuscule, infinitesimal crush on him. She couldn't help it, really. He was handsome and around her age, and everyone else had a crush on him too, so it wasn't like she was being weird or anything. He was just so very kind. Once, when she was treating a foreign princess with a twisted ankle, he had come in and told jokes to the girl to distract her. What am I supposed to do with that, huh? Who can resist that? She thought. Margaret, where are you tonight? Elise asked, tapping her lightly on the forehead. I'm here at the stupid ball that you dragged me to. Daydreaming is my only solace now. Elise snickered. Don't be dramatic. It's just a ball, not a funeral. Have some fun for a change. Margaret rolled her eyes. That's highly unlikely. Excuse me, ladies. Are you having a good time? A soft voice asked from behind them. The king had joined them behind the plant. Both women rushed to curtsy. I'm having a good time, Your Majesty, Elise said, but Margaret has been hiding behind this plant for the entire evening. Traitor? Margaret hissed, glaring at her friend. Lady Elise continued. You must help me. It's my last night, and I simply won't stand for my friend hiding her radiant beauty behind foliage. The king smiled, amused. Well, we certainly can't have that. Would you like to dance, Margaret?
Through her baby's hair. It was darker than she expected, and thick, too. You're gonna have so much fun with that during puberty, kid, she thought, smiling fondly down at her progeny. Your Majesty! Arrest the child, the king exclaimed, standing in the doorway. Don't be ridiculous, Richard. Come and coo over her, Margaret beckoned. Since the coronation, Richard had taken to calling her Your Majesty whenever he addressed her. She would find it more annoying if it weren't for the spark of delight in his eyes when she said it. She thought back on the coronation with more wry amusement than befitted the situation. In her heavy, restrictive dress and corset, she had just been on the cusp of passing out the entire time, and the second the ceremony finished, she had rushed off to her room so that somebody could unlace the thing just a little bit. She's lovely, just like you, Richard said, tipping her chin up a bit. Don't be sappy, Margaret shot back at him, her shy smile belaying her words. Oh, I do love him, she thought helplessly as he grinned. In her cradle, the baby cooed and kicked her tiny legs, missing her parents' attention. Richard immediately turned back to her, pulling a silly face to make her laugh. You were worth all the screaming, weren't you, Petal? Richard murmured to the child. Nothing is worth that kind of pain, Margaret insisted. But you come pretty close, kid.
Richard chuckled, pulling her into his arms. Have you thought of a name yet, love? He asked, pressing a chaste kiss to her cheek. Margaret sighed. No, I'm at a total loss. I have no idea what would suit her. The king hummed thoughtfully, watching the newborn babe sleep in the cradle. She's so perfect. Hair as dark as ebony, and lips as red as blood. Fair skin like snow. Margaret froze, dread creeping into her heart. She had heard those words before. How many times had her mother read those words to her as a child? Snow White, Richard said, smiling widely. When Margaret didn't respond, he frowned. Do you not like the name? Margaret shook her head. No, that's not it. That's just such a unique name. It caught me by surprise, she whispered, trying to keep the growing fear from her voice. It is, but our babe is unique herself. Why shouldn't she have a name to suit her? Margaret smiled, falsely, tense.
Late
Very
night,
true, love.
after her husband had gone to bed, Margaret was curled up in a chair, clutching her daughter to her chest. She was desperately trying to hold back tears, staring at Snow White's little round face. This made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. She wasn't the most well-versed in history, but even she was fairly sure there'd never been a princess named Snow White. The only Snow White she'd ever heard of was the girl from the fairy tale. Oh God, she sobbed, clutching the babe closer. The newborn princess whimpered, uncomfortable in her mother's hold. Guiltily, Margaret loosened her arms. But really, was this so odd? She'd already realized she'd gone through time. Was entering a story really that unexpected? But if this world truly was the world of Snow White, what did that mean for her precious daughter? What would happen to her little Snow? She'd never read any other version besides the Disney version, but even that wasn't pleasant. Her little Snow White would grow up alone, lonely and under the care of an evil stepmother that would one day try to kill her. But that didn't make any sense. Even if her little Snow was the Snow White, Margaret was still here. Her daughter still had a mother, and Richard was still married to her. There was no other woman in the picture. Maybe that was her chance, she realized. If she stayed alive, and Richard never remarried, then her Snow White would never be that Snow White. The little baby in her arms would never grow up to be the traumatized woman of the age-old fairy tale. Her resolve hardened. She would do everything she would to change the story. She refused to allow her precious baby to go through such hardship. Margaret would live. She would save Snow White. There was a knock on the door. Margaret looked up, startled. "Come in," she called. The door creaked open, revealing the figure of another woman. The queen relaxed. "Oh, hello, Tutor Magdalena," she greeted, smiling. The tutor curtsied. "Your Majesty?" "Is there something you needed?" Margaret asked, smiling tiredly. "His Majesty, King Richard, asks after you, my queen. He wishes to know if there's a reason you've yet to retire," Magdalena said. "I'll be retiring soon. I simply have much on my mind," Margaret said. "Very well, your Majesty. I will inform your lord husband." Curtsying again, the tutor turned and exited the room. The queen sighed, slumping down in the plush armchair. "Oh, little Snow, what am I going to do?"
She was sitting next to him when they received the news. Over 100 people? She asked, her face blank. Yes, your Majesty, the man said. He was a farmer from a distant village, his clothes shabby and plain. In that room he stuck out like a sore thumb, and he awkwardly shuffled his feet in the dead silence. This isn't an act we can let go unaddressed, Richard said. He spoke slowly, each word coming like it was pried out. We will go to war. He said the words for the entire room, but kept his eyes on her, waiting for her reaction. She tore her eyes away from her husband and addressed the man before them. His entire family was slaughtered in the attacks. One king gets greedy for land, and this is the result. He's lost everything, she thought. Sir, I admire your courage for coming to us. You have had a long journey. Rest here, and we will avenge the deaths of your friends and family. Whoever thinks that this heinous act is okay will face the full wrath of this land. We will stop them, whatever it takes. Oh, thank you, your Majesty. Oh, thank you so much, the man said. She sat back, unseeing. Her breath was harsh and unsteady. As sure as she sounded, Margaret was terrified now. War was no faraway concept for her. As a healer, she had experienced major conflict firsthand when her village was attacked by bandits. The aftermath was bloody. That day, Margaret had rushed from person to person, stitching up wounds here and resetting mangled limbs there. She had been in over her head, her rudimentary knowledge of first aid only going so far when it came to caring for people with severe wounds. "Margaret, look at me," Richard coaxed, his hands firmly pressed down into her shoulders. She blinked, her vision was clouded with tears. The room had been cleared, and only the two of them were here now. I'm coming with you. You know that, right? I'm your magical healer. Don't I need to be there?" she asked. Her voice trembled incessantly. "You have to stay, love. Watch after my kingdom. Keep it in one piece for me," he joked, his smile lasting only for a minute before he tugged her into his arms. "What, that I didn't have to go, love, but I do, don't I? We can't let this happen. All those innocent people." "Yes, and after my speech you better go wage war on those monsters." She laughed desperately, curling her fingers into his back and burying her face in his neck. "Of course, that was the most impressive speech ever. It will go down in the history books." She felt lips press against her hair. "Let's go tell Snow, yeah?" she suggested, pulling away. His face fell. Another thing to miss while he was gone. Another thing to come back for. "Yes,
Margaret sighed
let's."
at the tittering laughter of her ladies-in-waiting, glancing at Tutor Magdalena. The other woman met her gaze, rolling her eyes in exasperation. Both coming from a poorer, hard-working background, they found the incessant gossip of the noble ladies tiring. Smiling, the queen returned her attention to the needlework in her hands. She had little talent with embroidery, but it was required of the ladies of the court, so she begrudgingly took it up. "Oh, that's a beautiful dress, my queen," Countess Annalise said, pointing to the design Margaret was currently working on. Margaret frowned, looking at the offending stitches. She had been trying to make a flower. Sighing in annoyance, she set aside the cloth, leaning back into the couch. "My queen, how fares the princess?" Magdalena asked, smiling knowingly at Margaret. She perked up, smiling widely. If there was one thing she wanted to talk about, it was her daughter. "Oh, she's doing so well. She's growing up so fast. I can't believe she's the little babe I had a month ago. She's completely healthy, too, not even the slightest hint of a cold." Magdalena smiled. "She's beautiful, milady. I'm so glad the kingdom has a healthy air. It's all any of us could wish for."
"Would you like to join me for tea, Magdalena?" the queen asked. She was in her room, Snow White playing at her feet. Magdalena paused to consider it. "Is now the time?" she thought. "Is this it?" Aloud, she said, "Of course, your Majesty. Shall I make it?" "Yes, please." The queen ducked down to fiddle with Snow White's hair. It was long and dark and lovely. "I wish my hair looked like that. Stupid brat. Too pretty for her own good," Magdalena thought. She carefully poured the tea into cups and handed one to the queen, sitting down on the floor by Snow White, positioned in servitude at the queen's feet. "How are you today, your Majesty?" Magdalena asked. "Drink it. Drink it." "Quite well, thank you," the queen replied. "I received a letter from Richard today. The army is moving quickly, and he anticipates that he shall return in a matter of days." "Oh, for heaven's sakes! That is fantastic news, your Majesty," Magdalena said, a false front of enthusiasm plastered over her features. The queen noticed nothing. "Isn't it just great? I'm so excited," the queen enthused further. Absent-mindedly, she lifted the cup to her lips and took a sip. A few moments later, her face contorted. The queen gasped for breath, a hand clasped over her throat. "Do you not like your tea, your Majesty?" Magdalena asked, her voice sickly sweet. "What's going on?" the queen demanded, her voice raspy. She tried to rise to her feet, but stumbled, coughing and gasping. A green tint appeared over her skin. "You've been poisoned, your Majesty," Magdalena said, smirking devilishly. "I've tried my very best to help you, but the poison was simply beyond my meager healing talents." She slipped an arm around Snow White's middle and hitched her up in her arms. Snow White stared at Magdalena, confused. "What's wrong with Mamma?" she asked. "Don't worry about your mother, Petal. She'll be just fine. Here, take your doll." Magdalena shoved the doll into Snow White's arms and turned to leave the room. "Wait! Snow!" the queen gasped. She had fallen to the floor and was reaching out desperately for her child. "Goodbye, your Majesty." Magdalena stalked off. Several hours and many search parties later, the king and queen were both found dead. The queen in her chambers and the king in his tent in the army camp, a goblet of
"You,
tainted
Lady
wine by his
Magdalena
hand.
Abrams, swear to uphold the law of the land, to protect the kingdom in time of crisis, to maintain prosperity in times of peace, and to hold the crown until the Princess Snow White comes of age or marries a suitable man?" the bishop asked, his voice ringing throughout the cathedral. I, Lady Magdalena Abrahams, do swear to uphold the law, defend the kingdom, and maintain peace and prosperity until such time as the Princess Snow White may take up her rightful place as queen, she answered, keeping her eyes lowered and voice soft as if in humility. The bishop nodded. Then until such time as the princess can claim her rightful throne, I pronounce you regent and ruler of the kingdom.
Years later, in a small cottage far, far from the court, Magdalena watches Snow White fall to the ground, dead. A blood-red apple rolls from her hand, a single bite marring its crimson skin. Bending down, she picks up the poisoned apple, her bones creaking in protest. Straightening up, Magdalena stows the apple in her robe and takes a moment to observe the girl. She lays sprawled on the floor, her dark hair in sharp contrast to the pale, drawn expression on her face. Magdalena sighs. Goodbye, Snow White. She turns and exits the cottage, walking into the dark forest.